Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of us navigate our lives, especially when it comes to the point of midlife, we begin to question, is what we're doing what we really want to be doing? Is who we are really who we were meant to be? We begin to question this because we realize that the first half of our life, so we assume that we live to be at least 100 years old, is that was spent looking for approval, acceptance, and certainly are we doing the right thing. There are many people that help guide us along the way, especially in the early part of our years, that tell us what's best for us, the path that they feel that sometimes will bring us the least amount of pain. Well, through this, we discover that what we've actually done is we've surrendered who we actually are. The question is, who is that? Do you really know who that is and how we can actually cultivate and uncover that authentic self? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's going to help share what the good life might look like. Even though many of us struggle with the default voice in our heads that tells us that whatever we do will never be good enough, our guest will explain that the origin of this voice of dissatisfaction is the wounded child within who is subconsciously and retroactively seeking the acceptance, approval, and love of a primary caregiver who either withheld love or loved us conditionally. His newest book is How to Survive Your Childhood Now That You're an Adult. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Ira Israel. Ira, thank you for being on the program today.
Good morning, Daniel. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
You know, you've done a lot of studying with people from around the world, with including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and some of these people I've actually had the opportunity to meet as well as interview, including Sharon Salzberg and Marianne Williamson. And I'll tell you, it's quite a compelling book. Just in the title alone, it's intriguing where you realize, if people could see the genius in a way of what we're talking about here, we can begin to see how we can unclutter and get to that authentic self that we're all looking for, perhaps without even a weekend retreat. Tell us how this all started for you.
Well, for me, about 32 years ago, normally when people experience a midlife crisis, there's some sort of trauma or tragedy, and it puts in question all the things that you believed hitherto, basically what we considered to be normal. So about 32 years ago, there was a car accident, and I was very fortunate to experience my midlife crisis at 18. And it set me on this path. It's a good time
to experience a midlife crisis, I would think.
Well, I like to get things out of the way.
Right.
So it set me on a path studying philosophy for 8 years and ending up living in Paris and studying film and literature, art, music. And then I was in Thailand in 94, and I got hurt, and a woman taught me about Buddhism and Hinduism and healing and mindfulness, meditation, yoga, things like that. And then about 8 years later, I was involved in a highly dysfunctional relationship, and that got me interested in psychology. So for 8 years, I studied philosophy. For another 8 or 10 years, I studied Eastern philosophy, Buddhism and Hinduism. And then I studied psychology. And then it all just came together, and it came out in this book.
Now, it's really quite unique when you take a look at what we're talking about here when we think about how to survive your childhood now that you're an adult, how we seem to be using those same patterns that we used as children to basically get what we want. I was thinking about, as I was looking at this book the first time, that classic movie, The Big Chill. Mm-hmm. And there's a scene where Jeff Goldblum is sitting there and he's talking with one of his friends from colleges. They gather together, and he says, basically, we're all doing things to get what we want. And you think of how exactly true that is. Some of our styles may be charming, and some of mine may, mine is more direct, but basically, in the end, we're all trying to get what we want. So tell us how true that actually is.
Well, what you're saying is fascinating because the premise of the book is that we all desire to be loved unconditionally, and we grew up in this highly competitive society which only gave us tools to gain love conditionally. So that functions as a giant resentment factory because we create a false self to survive our childhood. And in that false self, that facade or persona, we have these tools like sarcasm or, we learn how to speak. We learn how to wear our shoulders. We learn how to dress. We learn that we develop an entire way of being in the world. And we do that in order to try to, I want to say compensate is the word, but it's really trying to get our emotional and psychological needs met at that time. And, when we look back, we should be ecstatic because whatever tools we developed during that time, they worked, and we know that they work because we're alive today. Unfortunately, if we're still using those same tools that we developed when we were 8, 12, and 14, they're actually probably hindering us from getting the type of love that we really crave now as adults. So it's time to, examine all the things that we consider to be normal and how we became who we are today, and do some tweaks or some hacks in order to really get the love that we crave.
When you described that, for some reason, I was immediately thinking about this YouTube video that I had seen with Anthony Robbins, who had actually helped this man who was in his 30s solve a stuttering problem within 20 minutes. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about there. And I found that fascinating because of the idea of how he went to the root cause of why he was doing this, that went back to a time that he was seeing a cartoon, and it was a way that he protected himself. Yeah. And he says, now that worked at that time, but don't you think at 35, probably you're a little past due to kind of get rid of that habit? You think to yourself, how do we get to those root causes that, like you say in your book, How to Survive Your Childhood, how do we get to uncover those things? Because I'll give you an example. We'll just use a personal one for me. One thing especially that my wife talks about, and sometimes we get into slightly heated arguments, and I can tell the more heated the argument, the more she's actually gotten to something inside of me. So I've kind of learned my lesson a little bit, but I still have some time to go. But it's about sarcasm. And I realize, and this is really true with comedians, that the more sarcastic they are, and I'm just saying this as an opinion, but I don't think it's too far off being a sarcastic guy myself, is that what they're doing is actually hiding pain.
It's a defense mechanism.
Exactly. So why don't we kind of elaborate, let's say, on, call it my problem,
Sure.
To kind of give people an idea of what we're talking about here.
So language creates reality. It's on the first couple of pages of the book. I ask, what's the relationship between thought and language? And there's actually a theorist, a psychiatrist out of France, Jacques Lacan, who says, language thinks me. So, I state in the book, language is a cage. So we have to really find ways to rise above that cage. And that's why this whole book is about authenticity and questioning. How can you be authentic if you're trapped within the constraints of a language and you're thinking that way? We live in this paradigm of cognitive behavioral therapy, which means that all emotions are preceded by thought. There's some kind of thought there, whether it's subconscious or conscious. And so we need to uncover those things. The quote that really helped me was Marshall McLuhan's quote, I don't know who discovered water, but I doubt it was a fish. So for me, being able to get some insights into our way of being in the world and the way our minds operate. So to get some insight into the way our minds operate, I like the tool of meditation, and I like the tool of specifically observing our thoughts. So to sit there at some time in the morning for me and to just spend 5 minutes like watching what that cogitation is like watching what comes up to the surface. And I quote Nietzsche in the book, who says, what if only the worst and most superficial thoughts rise to consciousness? There's all kinds of speculations on how many thoughts we have every day, but the propensity, the vast majority of them are the same thoughts that we had yesterday. Our thoughts are redundant, and our mind has a negativity bias. And then I argue in the book that, that negativity bias is in order to keep us safe, because the mind's primary goal is to try to stave off potential future trauma. And that's what we're doing. We were traumatized as children, and we were 7 or 10 years old. We were on the playground. Somebody pushed us, or I don't know what happened to every one of your listeners individually, but our mind reacted in this intense manner, and it said, "I will never let this type of humiliation happen again. I'm going to lift weights. I'm going to become the sarcastic person. I'm going to be the smartest guy in the room. I'm going to become rich. I'm going to become famous. I'll show those people." And that's what the mind does. So there's a whole section on the book in terms of learning how to accept these things and not be overreactive. Particularly, as I said, or as you said in the opening, this wounded child in us is running our lives, and it's wanting us to show up in particular ways. I spent a lot of time as a writer, or I spent a lot of time rather in cafes, and I'm fascinated by conversations people have, and just the subjects that they introduce in terms of like exotic vacations or shopping victories or things. They're they're really just trying to find their tribe and connect with other people, but the language they use is kind of this like one-upmanship and things like that. So for you, to answer your question about sarcasm, it's to understand that it's a defense mechanism, and it's actually pushing people away. When you were 12 or 15, everyone in school thought you were the cool guy, you were funny. But at this point in time, you're actually creating distance with your wife. So you need to just find a way.
I knew you were going to try to find a way to make her right. No, but it was really a unique, because we've been doing this show here for, what is it now, going on 16 years actually in February. And when you talk about observing your thoughts, there was a period of time, and I want to say that it was back probably right around, I want to say 2007, that for some reason she, and it could be just by fate alone, but we began getting scheduled, or she was scheduling a lot of what I would call neuropsychology interviews. And what made that so unique was I started feeling like and here was somebody that, like you, in my early 20s, I was studying the Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, Zen, things like that. The works of Alan Watts, you name it. And I could not figure out if I'm knowing all this, and my head is just stuffed with all this wonderful knowledge, and I was putting it somewhat into play, but for the most part I was more like, I think, intellectually understanding it, is why isn't my life, to me anyway, feeling any better, than it was before all this? So, lo and behold, as we fast forward, as I'm getting into now my early 40s, and I'm beginning, it seeming that at this particular period of time in 2007, that we were doing, the neuralistic programming talks, and we were doing psychology. I was having these wonderful guests going, and I started realizing, wait a minute, it can't be that simple. That what I'm thinking, that conversation that's going on in my head, is that really what's causing or influencing the majority of the actions and the outcomes that I'm having? And I thought, no, it couldn't be just that simple, really. Now, it would still be a few years, even after that discovery, where I started thinking, if I start paying attention to my thoughts or that chatter in my head, and I'm shooting this out to the listeners because you talk about this kind of stuff here in your book, is that as you can catch it, especially in the reactionary phase.
Exactly.
That if somebody says something or does something to you and you find a reaction stirring up in your head and you're about to open your mouth, and I'll give you an example of this. So I'm riding a MAX train when I was in Portland, Oregon. We had our dog with us. There was this lady before I boarded the train. It was, they weren't ready to leave yet, and she was asking the train, let's call it the train engineer, whoever it was, the person that operates the MAX train, about, letting dogs on the MAX. Well, she wasn't talking to me, but I know that she looked at my dog and decided that she had a lot to say about that, but she'd rather be passive-aggressive, at least to me anyway, and talk to this lady about it. And I, believe it or not, it was like a switch just clicked on, and I said, look, I'm just walking my dog on, and I made it my problem that she was talking about this lady to it, and it turned into a very heated verbal fight, okay, where I literally deflated this. I just tore her up. And I sat down, and it was with my wife was with me, and I sat down and I looked right at her and I said, where in the hell did that come from?
Yeah.
And I sat, and by the time we got to our next stop, I realized what was pissing me off wasn't her, is she clicked a switch, and I remembered back in school being punished, and sent to the principal's office, or a half day of school, whatever the case was, where somebody else somehow had the authority to decide and seal my fate without me having any say in it.
Right.
And that's what I was experiencing there. Now, just imagine coming to that conclusion so many years later. So I say to the listeners, if you have a reactionary state, pay attention to your thinking, because that's the veil that'll probably get you in trouble, maybe.
Well, in all of my courses, I do these exercises that show people that their reactions are maladaptive. They don't help us get our emotional needs met, our natural, what we consider to be natural reactions, because there are all these underlying subconscious influences. Like the one you were just talking about is about agency. When you were young, you had no agency. You weren't entitled to a voice in some ways. So this woman pissed you off, and you decided that 30 years later was the time to assert your agency and to have a voice. And so for me, what's interesting is in the section in the book on presence, learning how to cultivate non-reactivity. And that's why observing your thoughts is so imperative, because if you had
It's incredible, actually, when you get into the habit. It doesn't take long to get into that habit where you're catching everything like, God, man, I can't believe the stuff I got going on up there.
And for me, I laugh because I laugh at the thoughts that I have, because, it's really, it's funny that you mentioned a comedian before, didn't you? Or some sort of...
Yeah, we were talking, briefly about, and I know that on your website, you talk about the Chelsea Handler syndrome.
Yeah.
And how if we actually ask questions the way she does, we'd probably get arrested, especially this day and age with all this bullying and nonsense. Well, I shouldn't call it nonsense, but I feel, and I'm hearing this a lot from older people, it seems that we're in a society this day and age, with the idea of bullying or, the sexual abuses or proclivities that are going on in Hollywood, that have we turned into a society of sissies? We're all whining, that we all want, and it's just, we're in interesting times, especially because of social media.
And for me, so we need to mediate that authenticity with compassion. And that's the component of that in a lot of the interviews that Chelsea Handler, she I call it Chelsea Handlerism, because you can't really tell if she's intentionally setting the people on fire with some incendiary remark, and then because the way she sits there, it's like normal for her to ask a question about, anal sex or something, and because she has a straight face when she does it, and then you could see the other person feeling uncomfortable, and you can't really tell if she did it on purpose or not. But I actually think she's kind of oblivious, and what she considers to be normal conversation is really, you wouldn't sit in a business meeting, or as I say in the book, you wouldn't go in the Whole Foods and talk to the cashier about the things that she talks on her show. But there's a valid place for that, because that helps us let off steam when we sit there and cathartically laugh, with or near her, her guest. Then, there's a place for that in our society. So for me, to answer your question, we need to mediate all that authenticity with compassion.
So, and then you hit on the valid point, too. We hear a lot about being present or being in the moment, that seems to be the miracle of life. And a lot of people, they intellectually understand that. I was one of those. But I realized, as we're talking about, when you're observing these thoughts, and it seems, especially this day and age, you're hearing everybody talking about it now. Even though this was stuff that was going on, it's even in biblical times, for crying out loud. They were saying, hey, this is how you kind of navigate through this. But, that being said, as you do that, what I've noticed is that you actually begin to automatically clear that out of the way, And boy, I'll tell you, I feel so much happier and I feel so much
Right,
settled
exactly.
in my life. Like anything is possible now, and it's easy.
Well,
Is that what you find that happens with people that you work with?
on one of my DVDs, I say depression relates to thoughts about the past. Anxiety relates to thoughts about the future. The past no longer exists. It's dead. It's gone. The future doesn't yet exist. So how can depression and anxiety exist? So for me, like you just used the word happy. Like when you're in the present moment, you're happy. And so for me, I took a look in this book at the causes of depression. Why aren't we happy? Why are there 23 million Americans taking antidepressants every day? And, just to reiterate, our mind's primary job is to try to stave off potential future traumas because it was traumatized in the past. So being present, you're basically making those prejudices and those expectations and fears and resentments that your mind created in the past about traumatic situations, you're making them, well, you're at least putting them at bay if you're learning how to be present. And then, as I said, you can later, when those prejudices come up, you can cultivate non-reactivity and not feed into them. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah, because, if you have a reaction, you can usually feel that reaction before you think it. But it doesn't take long for that feeling to turn into the thought, or it comes into the library, pulls out that, Dewey Decimal System drawer and says, hey, this is this here, so let's go ahead and go with it. And you realize sometimes after the fact, how do you feel after that happens? And this doesn't have to be all negative outcomes. Like we're not talking about, for instance, me when I'm on that, light rail and I'm hearing this conversation and jumping in. They can also be, just silly little things as well where you just kind of felt like, boy, I kind of made an ass out of myself in a way, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I wanted to come on the show and talk about teaching at Esalen last year with a gentleman named Ken Dykewald. He has this beautiful quote. He teaches about aging, and he said, the vast majority of human beings who have ever walked planet Earth never reach the age of 40 years old. So for me, I'm 51. So it's such this is gravy for me. This is icing on the cake, particularly having almost died 30 years ago. Just having the privileges and freedoms that we have and the life expectancy and the availability of health care and things like that. I mean, we're compared to the 3.5 billion people who live on less than $1.90 a day, we're amongst the most privileged people to ever walk the face of the earth. And on top of that, having the internet allows someone like me who has a childlike sense of wonder just to research things, to go down rabbit holes, to learn about, all the things that have come before me and all the fascinating things that are going on in the world. There's a quote I actually have. It's on a painting at the University. At the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's just a quote by Einstein. He says, "There are two ways to live. You can live as if nothing is a miracle, or you can live as if everything is a miracle." So, for me, I choose to look at things and have them instill or inspire my sense of wonder. So I love learning. I take classes at UCLA now, and I just love all the things that are out there.
I'll tell you, Ira, it was really a wonderful privilege about a week and a half ago, as it is today, talking with you to bring these things together, is that I had done a segment on the lost art of love. This guy, he was a cardiologist who wrote this book about love. Now, I'm sure a majority of these people would probably clamor after a book like this, trying to think about how do I have a better loving relationship with somebody else. Fair enough. I mean, look at how much television and movies actually glamorize the idea of love. We're finally going to get that person into our lives who basically completes us. I guess there's only half of us, so we need somebody else to do that, right? And then when they don't, then of course it doesn't work out. You look at the shows where there's a bachelor or a bachelorette, and they get to choose and date 25 people to decide which one of these people is worthy to be in their lives happily ever after. And I know that you talk about the idea, I guess, of love addiction or that love syndrome, and I say this is true. I remember one time being sick in bed, and my wife gave me one of those sort of like People magazines to thumb through. And I remember all the anxiety reading through this magazine gave me, actually looking through it more than anything. All these stars with all this money, but yet they have all these problems. And I realized that as I got back to where the crossword puzzle was and started working on that, my anxiety went away. And I realized, wow, this is a real tool for transformation here, People magazine. And you take a look at, for instance, the Kardashians. Watch that show. I'm telling you, that's therapy right there if you pay attention to your reactions, as we're talking about today. But what is it with this idea of love and love addiction?
Well, in analyzing the frame of our culture, there's a whole chapter on the myth of romance. So this comes from, firstly, a French theorist, Denis de Rougemont. It's 1949. He wrote a book called L'amour et l'Occident, Love in the Western World. And then it's best explicated by Robert Johnson, the Jungian, in his book called We. So if I can summarize, romantic love as we know it is about 650 years old. It's esoteric to Western culture, and the vast majority of people who have ever gotten married on planet Earth do so for financial reasons. We're the only culture that gets married it's basically because of lust. We think that, we call it chemistry. But if you go back to the myth of Tristan and Isolde, on which this is based, and again, this is a very important part in the book because I say whatever is illicit becomes titillating because there's a concept called vérité. Whatever's behind the veil, whatever we hide and repress becomes desirable. And we don't like to think that, but like if someone says, whatever you do, don't eat those jelly beans on the top shelf, at 3 o'clock in the morning when you come downstairs for something to eat, that's the first thing you're going to go for. Because like you, on the light rail, we seek agency. We really don't like constraints. So when people say, like, don't speed, don't do this, for some reason that rebellious kid in us that's always individuating, you can't tell me what to do, So with the myth of romantic love, it's fascinating because Tristan is going to take Isolde, who's married to or betrothed to his uncle, back, and they're given to Ireland, and they're given this magic love potion, and they have unbridled lust, and depending on which version of the myth, it's either for 3 months or 3 years, and it's very interesting because if you look at the sex rates of people in America, they really think that because they had sex every day after they got married, that's going to happen for the rest of their lives, and they're going to enjoy it. But I think I use the analogy in the book of like vanilla ice cream. If your favorite thing on earth is Haagen-Dazs vanilla ice cream, and you have it every day for 3 years, at the end of the 3 years, you're going to be like, you know what? I don't need to have this every day. But then the problem is that people think, oh yeah, we got married and everything was wonderful, and now there's just no chemistry. And so what I'm trying to do is get people to look at why is there chemistry there in the first place, and it's usually because of something hierarchical. I've just written recently about this regarding Harvey Weinstein and all the sexual harassment. We live in this culture of inequality, of hierarchies that are based on power. And so we have to really analyze the and this is a whole other topic, the eroticism of power and what we consider to be loving experiences. I mean, I make a joke in the book and I say, I don't think anybody watches pornography and says, "Oh, that's so sweet. They really love each other." It's all about power. It's all about domination. And so we really need to reanalyze, like, why do you want to be with this person? And I'm all in favor. And since this show is for people over 50, I'm all in favor of renewable marriage contracts. And the joke I make is that marriage for life was a fantastic idea in the 13th century when we lived till 28. But now that we're living till 87, or as you said earlier, 100 years old, like marriage for life is a stupid idea. We should, if you're going to have a kid, you should sign a contract saying, I'm on board for 18 years. But, other than that, if you're not having kids, every couple of years you should renegotiate. You should say like, oh, I like this, I don't like that. It should be an agreement rather than this imposed upon thing till death do us part. Because if you look at the statistics, it's obviously not working out.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, 1 in 2 people just don't stay together anyway. So
right. Let's be honest about these things. Let's be authentic. Why are we getting together with people? Do they make us feel good about ourselves? Are they the missing part of us? Is it just, can you just have great sex with someone and not be married to them? Maybe there's all sorts of understandings and agreements people can have. But if you look at the constraints of our society in terms of marriage and what we're doing and all the legalities, it's really, we need some radical shifts.
Well, and I completely agree with you. In fact, as I was bringing up the guest on his book, The Forgotten Art of Love was the actual title. Mm-hmm. We realized that in this conversation that went on for an hour, that part, let's call it romantic or relationship love, was actually at call it the most basic level of human reality. People might say, well, you out of your mind? I said, if you go and you listen to this interview, you'll realize as we transcend to what ultimate love actually looks like. This is that unconditional love. And we went through the layers, for instance, the kind of families that have children with super special needs. And until you experience that in your life, which he had because he had a son who had Down syndrome, he experienced love in a different way. First of all, he started seeing that all around him. Boy, there's these parents with kids with conditions that are just unimaginable, yet they're loving him with every breath and thread of they are as though they're normal. And he says, it was because I transcended that experience of selfishness that I felt, why did this happen to me, so forth and so on, that now I had a son who was showing me the world through a pair of eyes that I would have never even imagined before. See, this was the level this conversation had, to the point that you got to a level of unconditional love of just simply being alive. How could I be in service to other people? And he says, as you get to this level in life, and we're talking like the Dalai Lama, for instance, you realize why these people are so continuously happy. You've gotten out of that bargain bottom basement of romantic love that all of us are stuck in, that samsara, that wheel of life, and you've transcended that to a level that's just unimaginable and brings you riches that you couldn't even fathom when it comes to being alive.
So in my Esalen workshops, at some point in time, when I'm discussing the things that we're discussing right now, I'll turn to the 100 people and I'll say, raise your hand if the first thought that you have upon waking every morning is, how can I love more? Because, most of us are like, oh, what time is it? Why am I up so early? What is the mortgage due? We have all these mundane concerns. But really, if you want to be happy, love more. Be in service to other people if you want to lead a meaningful life. And then the only thing that correlates strongly to happiness is the quality of your intimate relationships. So we have to overcome all those fears created by the wounded children in us and learn how to, as you said with this gentleman, love more.
Now, I'm sure that your guests, the people who attend this, at first come out of the gate full of enthusiasm. They want to apply these lessons, but then they realize deep inside of them there's still more work to do because the resentment comes to the surface. Now, resentment, I would say, comes from expectation of a particular outcome. And I know that you had studied Buddhism for many, many years, and so there's a practice I'd like to bring up that I'm pretty sure is in Buddhism that I actually started putting into play, and I found it to be wonderful because of sort of the transcendence I was dealing with at the time, and that is to simply gift someone without bringing any recognition toward yourself for doing that.
100%.
Okay. So you give somebody a gift, but let it be mysterious where it comes from. Don't say it came from me. Now, I'll give you an idea.
Exactly.
And this was a lot of fun. I was in a supermarket one night, And here were these two little kids. I'd say they were probably about 10 years old. And so they got on the counter, they got their candy and their soda pop, and it was really funny because they were digging around trying to find their money, and I looked at the clerk and I handed them a $10 bill, figured that should be enough. And then I put my finger to my mouth to let them know, don't let them know where it came from. So he rang this up, and finally the kids got their money out, and they went to put it on the counter, and the clerk just simply waved his head. He says, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and take your things and go. And you watch these kids just mesmerized, looking at each other like, what the heck was that all about?
I know.
But you can imagine the story they must have taken forward. Now, I did pay attention. I was kind of inadvertently involved because I get to witness that. But imagine when you're actually out there doing that with no thought of ever having that come back on you. And the kind of idea that a person, gets to experience of, man, life can really be miraculous. You see, that's a unique ripple effect right there.
Yeah,
so where does resentment actually come from?
From expecting fairness, from expecting some sort of that, I left $10 for those kids, so I should walk out and find a $10 bill on the street, because that's how your mind operates. Your mind has this...
Right, but I didn't feel that way. I just enjoyed the moment. It was really quite
I agree.
cute.
Well, that's the overcoming. That's the amazing thing, is that, and that's why all true philanthropy is done anonymously. And there are people who go through toll booths and then they'll pay double and they'll just say, let the guy behind me pass through, for free. So there, we all have to learn that we're in this together, and it's not a zero-sum game. And if if you have two slices of pie, that doesn't mean that I have two slices of pie left. We live in an abundant society, and yet we have this scarcity mentality that we have to hoard things, and oh my God, there's taxes. Taxes are a burden. We don't think about our school system. We don't think about our safety. We don't think about our roads. We don't think about hospitals. We don't think about libraries. We don't think about the various wars we're in. We're just thinking, oh my God, what a terrible burden this is on me, these taxes, right? I mean, and I talk about this in the book too. So we have to figure out a whole new paradigm, a whole new way of understanding that we're interdependent and we're all in this together, and that we can't have such disparity with the 1% of people having. I just read somebody's building a $500 million house in Los Angeles. Like why you could feed an entire country for a year with $500 million. Like, why would you want to buy a house with that? I mean, they're so, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, there's the prizes of our society, as I discuss in the book, and I also quote Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. The prizes, the trophies in our society are actually causing alienation, and I think that manifests as depression, because what we really want is to embody that connection with other people. So, it's much better to throw a dinner party and just, invite a bunch of friends over than it is to buy 3 handbags and a scarf.
I'm reminded, too, of that documentary, because you brought up the $500 million home. That documentary called The Queen of Versailles. Do you remember that one?
I do.
Okay. Just to give the listeners an idea, this was a story about a guy who became the largest independent timeshare builder, if you will, in the world, and decided that he wanted to build a replica of a castle in Versailles as his own home. I think it was in Florida. And at the time, that's when the real estate bubble began to burst. And because, like everybody else, he was out there loaning basically sloppy money to people that really couldn't afford anything. And so he ended up, losing his shirt during that situation. So they actually had to, halt the building of it. But, as you watch this documentary, to me, I kind of had some balance. Well, if you could do that doing what you do, which was being able to get people to experience the dream of a luxury vacation within reasonable, within a reasonable budget, a middle-class person, who's out there working hard, who wants to experience what it's like to stay, in a place that the rich or the famous would stay in. I thought, that's kind of a cool little dream to make that, reachable for people so they could see that it's possible. Why shouldn't this guy be able to build a house like that based on that premise? But then people would say, well, but then see, he was doing those loans like everybody else to people that, who knows, they were fudging the numbers, whatever. So you kind of find yourself, at least in that documentary, at least for me, by the end of it, I was kind of rooting, hoping, hey, God, I hope things turn around for you, because you realize what he was trying to do. What would you say to something like that?
Well, for me, I look at what people tend to say on their deathbed, because that's really important to me. And also, I always ask in my classes, what do you want to say on your tombstone? So it turns out that on the majority of people's deathbeds, when they're dying, they do not say, oh, I should have spent more time in the office. What they say is, everybody says, I should have loved more. So why are we running around today talking about how crazy busy we are and how we're trying to get all these things done when we're just actually pushing files around, pushing papers, trying to sell things to each other? Like, when what we know at the end of the day makes us happy is love. And the second thing, and this is something fascinating about the next generation, they might actually be 2 generations away from me by now, millennials. So it turns out that millennials learn that on people's deathbeds, what they remember are experiences. They do not remember possessions. So there is a movement in our culture to, not have that ephemeral ego gratification of purchasing something. There's a book that came out 4 years ago called The How of Happiness by Sonia Lyubomirsky, and she goes through all these studies on what makes people happy. And it turns out that, and I talk about this in the book in the first couple pages, the hedonic treadmill. The desire is actually more important than what is desired. So if you think, I'm going to be happy when I get this promotion, when I get this job, when my kids go to college, all these, things like that, it turns out statistically, scientifically, that happiness lasts for about 6 to 18 months. But then after that, you have a new goal is put in your mind. So there's a study done that I quote in the book. It's called Accident, Victims, and Lottery Winners. And it talks about, the things that we expect that would make people happy for a long time, like winning the lottery, and what we expect people to, would make them unhappy for a long time. And it turns out that people, in these studies, that people who were in terrible car accidents, about 18 months later, they were back to their normal happiness level. And the same thing with lottery winners, because our mind tends to overestimate things that we think will make us happy. If someone came up to me today and said, here's the winning lottery ticket, I'm going to give it to you. There's one condition. You can never complain again about anything. But I would obviously agree. I would be like, I'm on board. But scientifically, I know in 18 months, I'll be back to the normal that I'm at today, and I'll be like, really? It's going to, and there'll be some complaints. So it's really fascinating because our mind underestimates our resilience. When you're in a bad car accident, you say, oh my God, I can't believe this is terrible and this horrible thing, and, I'm disfigured or whatever. But it turns out statistically that in 18 months, you'll be at the same level of happiness. So for me, to answer your question regarding the film, there's 2 voices in our head at all times. One is about ego gratification, and that's like, oh, if I buy this expensive thing or go to this exotic place, I'll be happy. And it turns out that, yes, that's true, but it's ephemeral. And then on the other shoulder is the angel, which says, be loving, be compassionate, don't be selfish. And again, this is all about cultivating non-reactivity, listening to both voices, and then making healthy decisions that are going to keep you at the high end of your happiness spectrum for the longest time possible.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, I was just thinking about a guest that I had some years back. Her book was entitled Bright Light, happens to be actress Dee Wallace. People might remember her from the big-time movie E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And in this book, which is basically also sort of an autobiography or memoir, if you will, she talks a lot about the movie she's in, but basically the spiritual lessons she had also learned to grow with through time, through these experiences, and how she could apply those lessons through what was going on in these movies. But There was one point she was talking about a particular, call it an acting coach, that she considered to be the Zen master of acting coaches that could pick up on any little nuance and just bring that out. As I was reading about this, I thought of the genius that if you really want to start doing that archaeological dig, to make this life transformation, take acting classes.
Yeah.
And I say this is true from direct experience, not that I've taken acting classes, but as a host, I remember as I started first hearing my voice on the radio, I thought to myself, there were all these little criticisms going on in my head about who I thought I was. There was a time I would look at billboards and I would see the local broadcasters that were prominent, community influencers, and I thought, who am I to think that I even belong in that same circle of influence as those guys there? And what's more interesting is that as I began to help do film work, in other words, broadcast people on video, for instance, so they could have sort of like a little YouTube presence, if you will, the kind of reactions I would see people where I said to myself, I remember I was talking just like that some years back. And so I would nurture and coach them through that you're a much better person in front of the camera or on the mic or wherever that may be in your life than you think you are.
Well, it's funny. In the book, I talk about how nobody's born with a voice in their head that says they're not good enough or they'll only be happy when they graduate from Harvard or whatever, thing. And that negative self-talk is a part of assimilating the characteristics of our caregivers in some ways. So for me, I really like to look at who raised us, whether it's the school system or nannies or older brothers or parents or grandparents, and then try to find out whose voice is that in our head, which is hypercritical, which is the one that's saying, I could be better, my voice is this, or I should lose 15 pounds or whatever it is, because none of us were ever born with that I'm not good enough, I'm terrible at this, I'll never amount to anything voice in our heads. It's the way we assimilate the voices of our primary caregivers, which causes that negative self-talk that's of epidemic proportions in our society.
A good word. Epidemic proportions. Fascinating. This is a fascinating subject, and I knew that when this came across my desk, I thought, this is something I want to talk about here, especially for people by midlife, because I think they begin to get to that point where they're shedding that skin and saying, I've done all these things that people said I should be doing, whether it's my parents, my teachers, my friends. I'm at this point in my life, I don't feel any more happiness than I did 20 years before, and I'm tired of it. And it's not a midlife crisis, it's just an awakening.
And I actually go one step further, and I think that people feel betrayed. People feel betrayed because they were sold a bill of goods. If I went to an Ivy League school and I made a lot of money, I would marry a sexy person, and we would have 2.3 kids, and she would drive a Subaru, and I would drive a Jaguar. I'm dating myself, obviously. And we'd be happy. And instead, as I say in the book, the average mortgage is $222,000. The average credit card debt's $4,000. The average student loan is $26,000 when kids get out of school. So we're on these hamster wheels because pop culture told us what would make us happy, and those things don't make us happy. Loving relationships make us happy. So we should have classes in our school system like how to be a loving person or what is intimacy instead of chemistry and biology and things that, for me, have no application as an adult. We need to learn, these things. And the other thing that's really interesting about your show is that because we're living longer, there's all these people in my world, they happen to come to my classes at Esalen a lot. I think they're called second actors when their kids leave, go to college, and I'm 51 years old. I don't know if it's just people in my orbit, but there's a lot of people who basically have retired. And they don't like to use the R word because, they're 50 years old, so they don't, it's kind of, embarrassing. For me, I would.
They don't want to feel they've been surplused.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're going to live another 40 years. Like, what do you do if you don't get your personal identity through your job anymore? Who are you? For me, personally, I would just take classes. I would have retired tattooed on my forehead so people don't ask me anymore. I would just say, I'm retired. I know I look really young, but I'm just learning. I love to learn. I love to evolve. I'm just taking classes. Don't ask me what I do for work. But these people who take my classes, they don't love learning as much as I do, and they're sitting there thinking, what do I do now? I'm going to live another 30, 40 years.
Right.
I have enough money in the bank. My marriage was great for 30 years. Now it's over. My kids are at college, and they now live in Europe, or they're skiing in some place, or they're in Peru, and so I'm all alone, and I don't have to work. What do I do? And so for me, that's amazing. Like, I love those people. Those are my favorite people to work with. When they come to my classes that I teach on cultivating meaning and happiness, those because when you have all that privilege and luxury and you've accomplished these great things, and yet your mind is saying,
what's next?
Yeah, what's next? What am I going to do? Like, I accomplished all these goals, and now what? So, yeah, it's fascinating how long we're living, that we have this life expectancy, and that we really don't understand the stages of our bodies. We don't understand the stages of our minds. We don't understand the stages of relationships. So I hope that my book raises consciousness about all these things and helps people understand that their desires that were inculcated into them, even negationally, because of, some parents or caregivers were oppressive or repressive in some ways. And now, they're 55 years old and they want to go to Burning Man, or they want to go to a nude beach, or they want to try some other exotic things. Or
well, here's one for you, too, and I'll tell you a funny experience is, you know how back in the day when, and you hear this a lot when it comes to public speaking, you call it, I think it's the Jan Brady syndrome, where the idea is if you're nervous about public speaking, then get up and picture everybody in their underwear, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, we've all heard, I'm sure you've heard of that one. So I'll do you one a little bit better. And this isn't one-upmanship, but I'll tell you, after this experience, what happened. So I was asked, because we actually did a segment on nudist colonies, because you brought up nude beaches, I thought I'd bring up this story here. So apparently out in Estacada, Oregon is one of the oldest nudist camps in the United States, or the oldest, I guess. So we had a guest come on the program and talk about, well, what is it like to, kind of cross that border there and decide you're going to run around the place and play volleyball, do dancing and all that kind of stuff without clothes on? And it was quite an enjoyable talk, but even furthermore, the guest extended an invitation to my wife and I, well, why don't you come on out and visit us for a day?
That's
so
awesome.
I thought, what the heck? And I was telling a few people about how we were invited to go out there and actually give a talk about our show on top of it. So I get out there, and so the first obvious question I was asked before I went up to this was, well, do you plan on standing there naked? And I said, well, I might. I don't know yet. And so I was feeling a little braver as time went on until the time that we went out to where this place is. We get on the gravel road, and sure enough, we're probably about halfway in. And there was this couple coming down the pathway wearing tennis shoes, completely naked. And, of course, these people without clothes, they have to put their hands high in the air when they wave at you. Look, I'm not wearing anything. How y'all doing kind of a thing, right? Then the reality of what I was getting into hit me, and I thought, well, I don't know if I'm going to have the kind of brass that it takes at this point, to stand there naked and give a talk. But what I will tell you is, although I didn't take my clothes off, I was in shorts and a light shirt, but there was nothing more surreal than giving a talk, or a speech, if you call it, in front of 40 to 50 people without a stitch of clothing on. So I didn't mean to, but I won up Jan Brady. I didn't have to imagine the people in their underwear. I got to see them without any.
There's a lovely lecture on the internet by Simon Sinek, and he talks about how public speaking, the fear of public speaking, the anxiety. There's a famous Harvard study where it says people would rather die than speak in public, because they went through people's fears, and the number one fear people have, and number two is dying, and number one is public speaking. And so some very smart person, but just made a cute title, people would rather die than speak in public. So for me, I listened to Simon Sinek's YouTube clip on public speaking, and he said that he realized that the same physiological response for anxiety was excitement. Like the same, like the sweaty palms and the jitters. Like when you're excited, it's the same thing as being nervous. So what he just did was he conflated them, and instead of saying to himself in his mind, "Boy, look, I'm checking with my body. Boy, it seems like I'm really nervous," he just rephrased the languaging, and this was how we started our conversation regarding languaging. Wow, this is so exciting. So for me, now I actually do the same thing. Like if I'm speaking in front of 100 people or whatever happens, like I haven't been nervous in years about public speaking. It's like I'm just thinking, wow, this is fascinating. Like I'm going to meet all these different people from all these different walks of life, and I'm sure someone's going to ask me a fascinating question, and I'm going to, be able to interact with these people in some ways. So there's a great, hack for the fear, for overcoming the fear of speaking in public. Just reframe it as
change your perception about what it is. Exactly.
Totally.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ira, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program. I knew this was going to be a lot of fun. The book is How to Survive Your Childhood Now That You're an Adult, or Now That You're a Midlife, or however you want to phrase that. Remember, it's about reframing perception there. How can people find out more about your work? Is there a website they can go to?
Sure. Please visit my website. It's just my name, iraisrael.com. And there's free videos on there, how to get the love you really want, happiness masterclass, and there's also links to my 5 DVDs, which are all on Amazon Prime for free. And then the book, How to Survive Your Childhood Now That You're an Adult. Anybody who wants to either, just send me feedback on the book or interact in some ways, just shoot me an email, ira@iraisrael.com. I'm 100% available.
And not only that, just to make this an encouraging step for people to take too, hey, enjoy the journey. It's going to be uniquely yours. You never know where you're going to end up, but I'm certain it's going to be a lot better than you think it will be. Ira, thank you again for being on the program, and for the guest today. The book is How to Survive Your Childhood Now That You're an Adult. Thank you so much for being on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you, Daniel.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us today. You can also discover more. Visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.